Okay, so welcome back. Let's talk a little bit about the female reproductive system. So now we are talking about the ovaries, the fallopian or uterine tubes, the uterus, vagina, vulva, and the mammary glands. So in a similar sagittal section that we saw at the male, we again see the uterus, the vaginal canal. Again, this is separate from the urinary bladder and urethra. There's the external genitalia, including the clitoris, the labium majora and minora, as well as the internal reproductive organs of the ovaries and the uterine tube. And not featured in this image are the mammary glands, but obviously, hopefully obviously to you, these are producing the milk. There are quite a few reproductive ligaments holding things in place. So for example, there is a round ligament to the uterus. There's going to be an ovarian ligament keeping the ovaries in place. So that's right here. There are other suspensory ligaments that are going to cover blood vessels. There's a very broad ligament. Let me see if I see that. Yeah, right here. It's sort of behind the uterus. It's a broad kind of banded ligament. So all of this is making sure that even as after one childbirth, these organs can all go back into the correct place for I should say multiple pregnancies. How's that? Okay. The ovary also has an outer tunic called tunica albuginea. Again, it's this connective tissue along the outside. It has a cortex, so this outer portion is the cortex. That's where all these follicles will be, as well as this inner medullary region. Now, when you look at images in the lab portion, what you will see is many of these primordial follicles. They will all be along the very outside edge of the cortex. A female is born with all the eggs that she will ever have, or all the primordial follicles that she will ever have. There is no more further cell division after birth. So there's many of these. The ovaries will get signaling from luteinizing and follicle stimulating hormones to basically stimulate the production of a new follicle. So several of these primordial follicles will respond to follicle stimulating hormone to produce a primary follicle. Usually only one of these primary follicles that have been stimulated will continue on to a secondary follicle. The rest will die off. Then you form this secondary follicle, and what you're looking at is that inner little circular dot. That's the actual egg itself. These are all of these follicular cells and a fluid-filled space that is forming, or all of these are around the egg to support it until it becomes this Graafian or mature follicle. You can see the size of that. So again, here's the egg or the oocyte here, and then all of these are supporting follicular cells along with this fluid-filled antrum. Basically, this will continue to fill with fluid until it sort of ruptures or erupts from the ovary or is expelled from there. All of these cells that were here along the outside, they stay behind. So not everything leaves with it. So it's only about this portion that's actually ovulated. And then what you're seeing here, the thing that remains becomes this corpus luteum. And you can see all this blood that's in between. It's just right there. It gets reabsorbed by the ovary. This corpus luteum will help maintain the uterine lining, preparing a potentially fertilized egg for implantation. If there is no feedback from a fertilized egg, the corpus luteum eventually will degrade. That's what you're seeing here, into something called the corpus albicans, and this is just connective tissue that remains in the ovary. And then as this degrades into basically this connective tissue, the uterine lining is no longer supported, and that's how menses begins. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So just looking a little bit more at the histology of one of these mature follicles. So those cells along the very outside, these follicular cells, there's two rows to them. One are the theca cells, the other are granulosa cells. So you can see the theca cells here along the outside. The granulosa cells will be along the inside. There's some granulosa cells that will be attached to this blue ring called the zona pellucida. Around that is the corona radiata. Just this layer of cells attached to that zona pellucida. And then you'll have this other layer of granulosa cells forming something called the cumulus oophorus. And again, there's this follicular fluid-filled space called the antrum. And then here's a real picture of the ovary. You can see large ovary. Here's how big that follicle is. You can see it's kind of almost pushing out of the ovary. Then here is the oocyte, and you can kind of see how it's just like kind of like I don't know, being released. So it's not like a massive tear in the ovary, kind of like the last image indicated. I mean, there is going to be some disruption to that ovarian wall, but again, it's not nearly how bad it looked in that drawing. Anyway, you can take a look at a YouTube video showing you ovulation, as well as read a little bit more about it in this BBC report. After an egg is ovulated from the ovary, it is going to be picked up by the fimbria of the uterine tube. Those are these finger-like processes. There is this first portion of the uterine tube is called the infundibulum. So these fimbria are going to kind of move, sort of sweep the oocyte into the uterine tube. There is this enlarged portion called the ampulla, and then it narrows as it connects to the uterus itself. That portion is called the isthmus. If we take a look at the histology of the uterine tube, the mucosa layer has ciliated columnar epithelium. There are secretory cells that are going to produce nutrients. Those nutrients are thought to be there actually for sperm cells. So a lot of times as the sperm are traveling up through the cervix into the uterus, I mean, this is quite the journey these tiny little cells have to undergo. The few that remain, I mean, remember, hundreds of millions are found in one ejaculate. Only a few hundred will actually make it to the correct uterine tube. Here, once they're in the uterine tube, these secretory cells are thought to help sustain them, where they take a bit of a rest before pushing on to fertilize an egg. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me back up for a second. There is a muscularis layer, so it has circular and longitudinal smooth muscle, again for peristaltic contractions that will help move a fertilized egg, and just an egg in general, unfertilized or not, down toward the uterus. And then, of course, the serosa that helps connect it to the external abdominal cavity, I should say pelvic cavity. The uterus itself has a fundus, so kind of like the stomach had that fundus portion, that's just that top rounded portion. There is a body, and here's actually a very nice view of this broad ligament. You can kind of see how broad the ligament actually is. It's not like a narrow band, kind of like the ovarian ligament is. Again, it's kind of like a sheet. Then there is the isthmus of the uterus as well as the cervix. So all of this making up the entire uterus. The uterus has three main layers. The first is the endometrium. There's two subcompartments of the endometrial layer. There's the top, or the part that's closest to the lumen, called the stratum functionalis. This is the part that is built up and then shed during the menstrual cycle, during menses. And then the stratum basalis, this part is not shed. This is what replenishes then the stratum functionalis. The myometrium is simply the muscular layer. There's three layers of muscle. And then there's a peritoneum that, again, helps connect it to the pelvic cavity and the other pelvic organs. The secretions of the cervix produce a mucus-like secretion. So you can see it's a mixture of water, some sugar protein, glycoproteins, other lipids, enzymes, inorganic salt. It does change its consistency depending on where in the menstrual cycle a female is. During ovulation, the secretions of the cervix are thinner, making it easier for sperm to move through. When the female is not ovulating, the cervical mucus forms sort of like a plug. It's very thick. It's thick enough that sperm cannot make it through. Because again, remember, sperm are foreign microbes to the female's immune system. So, and the uterus, it's one of the protection mechanisms that the uterus has. Like, it's keeping itself as clean or free from infections as possible. Okay, that mucus will supplement the energy needs of the sperm. So again, when it's thin and receptive to the sperm, it will provide them with nourishment as well as sort of a means to get through the cervix and into the uterus. Okay, now talking a little bit about the vaginal canal. Again, it's the same layers that we've seen, the mucosal layer, muscularis layer, and then an adventitia. The mucosal layer has stratified squamous epithelium. Now again, this is non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. There's also some areolar connective tissue. There's lots of glycogen that will break down to form an acidic pH. This is important to maintain the proper health of the vagina. There's a muscularis layer. This is smooth muscle that allows quite a bit of stretch, enough for a baby's head to get through. And then again, there's adventitia that helps connect it to the surrounding tissue. And you can see the vaginal layer is the vagina is between the bladder and then the rectum. The vulva or the pudendum, this is going to be the external genitalia. So the mons pubis, which is simply the fatty pad over the pubic symphysis. The labia majora and minora, which would be homologous to, in males, this would be what fuses to produce the scrotum in males. The clitoris is erectile tissue and is much larger in size than just what is external. Kind of like the bulb of the penis had a portion that was internal, I guess, to the male's body. So does the clitoris. It actually has erectile tissue that curves around. So it's actually much larger than what you actually see. The bulb of the vestibule, I don't know if that's labeled right here, but these are erectile tissue just deep to the labia on either side of the vaginal orifice. This will be homologous to the corpus spongiosum and bulb of the penis, as I mentioned before. There's something called the paraurethral gland. The older name for this is Skene's gland. So if here's a urethra, this is the clitoris, this is the vaginal opening. You'll notice here there's the opening to the Skene's gland. This is also called the paraurethral gland because next to the urethra. It's also called the lesser vestibular gland, a few different names. These will produce a mucus-like secretion that will help lubricate the vagina and protect it from infections. It also, again, so as I mentioned, it helps prevent the spread of urinary tract infections. In males, this is what in males would turn into the prostate gland. So again, remember, we have similar reproductive systems during development. It just depends on which one is activated. In some people, depending on how the paraurethral glands are positioned, their size, all this kind of different factors, it may allow for ejaculation in females. So you can see it's like a mucus-like ejaculation during orgasm. Again, very similar to the proteins that are found in the male. Then the greater vestibular glands, also called Bartholin's glands, you can see the opening down here. This would be similar in the males to their bulbourethral glands. It's from the same tissue developmentally. And it also will produce a mucus-like substance that will help with, the spelling there, lubrication during sexual arousal. Now, you may have heard of the hymen in females. This is basically this very thin bit of mucosal tissue along the opening of the vaginal canal. This is the very big thing in our culture and some other cultures about virginity in the female, which is silly, frankly. But basically, it is the presence or the absence of this hymen is what people consider for that. But frankly, there are many different sort of ways that the hymen can form, all of these normal and usually non-problematic. The only one that really becomes a big issue is when the hymen completely covers the opening to the vaginal canal. This becomes an issue because when a female reaches reproductive age and begins to have their menstrual cycle, there is nowhere for the menstrual blood to leave the body, and then that can cause infections and sepsis. Otherwise, all of these are normal. Sometimes females are even born without a hymen. It's totally normal. It's just an extra piece of little thin tissue around the vaginal opening. And again, it can have septum, multiple configurations. Okay, mammary glands. So I happen to think this is the coolest thing, that basically the body took sweat glands, you've heard me, sweat glands, modified them, added some extra proteins into sweat. So basically all milk is highly protein-filled sweat. Yum! I don't know. Anyway, there's lots of protein and fat as well in milk. And that's what these glands are producing and releasing based on prolactin levels, right, inducing the production of milk, and then oxytocin propelling that milk out the nipple. The size of a female's breast has nothing to do with the actual mammary glands. Rather, it is the adipose tissue surrounding them. There's many different, and let me back up, there's suspensory ligaments as well, helping hold everything in place. Sometimes there's more connective tissue in some females' breasts than others. It can give it more of a fibrous sort of feel than others. But as far as anatomy goes, we have our actual mammary glands. Then you have the mammary ducts. They go into a lactiferous sinus, into a lactiferous duct. Right, there's the areola, which is that area around the nipple. It's thought that the areola helps babies find and latch onto the nipple for easier suckling. And then you'll notice that, right, both the fat and the mammary glands sit on top of the pectoralis muscle. All right, I will stop there before we get into talking about the female reproductive cycle. If you have any questions, please let me know.